One of the ways that they're going to do this is through honoring different historical bonds and different fraudulent gold deals that have been done in the past. I talked to you about how that there's much more gold in the world than the world admits. I think there's in excess of 2 million metric tons of gold, whereas the world says there's about 177,000 metric tons of gold, essentially. And so what we see is this. Here's from J.C. Collins' Philosophy of Metrics. He says, here's the apparent plan. In part one, we were introduced to the 1913 Chinese gold reorganization loan bonds. A final payout on these bonds is indeed in the works and is one part of the overall 2010 Code of Reforms process. Every time a deal was to be finalized with the bonds, it corresponded to the debt ceiling debate and Code of Reforms within Congress. So basically what he's saying is this. He's summarizing it in just a sentence, but let me expand on that a little bit. This is a Chinese government bond. This is, you can see here, you probably can't see, but this is the 1913 bond that he's talking about. This one is for 25 million pounds sterling, which in 1913 was equivalent to about $5 a pound. And this was a bond at that particular, and this is in different languages. This is in English over here on the left-hand side. And it says the Chinese government 5% reorganization gold loan of 1913. That is, this is done in pound sterling, but it is in gold-backed pound sterling 1913. What happened? The Chinese did not honor these bonds. People around the world bought these bonds and were able to, and let me just go over here and find, I'll just read this one paragraph. From 1900 to 1940, the Chinese government issued millions of dollars in sovereign debt, most notably a large tranche of $25 million pound notes issued at 5% in 1913, set to mature in 1960. This massive bond funded the modernization of China's infrastructure and was widely acquired at the time by governments, banks, and investors across the globe. However, in 1938, China defaulted on its binding engagement upon the government of the Republic of China and its successors, leaving millions of global creditors unpaid. In accordance with the terms of the bond, successor government doctrine, and accounting standards, the United States can and should hold China accountable to its obligations. The Chinese bonds in question are held throughout the world by treasuries, banks, companies, and over 2,000 private U.S. investors, many of which are active in seeking remuneration. Critically, the U.S. Treasury and Department of Justice and State are understood to hold substantial portions of this Chinese foreign debt. That's right, the U.S. Treasury and Departments of Justice and State have actually been out trying to acquire this from the local U.S. citizens. And they don't always use the most ethical ways of acquiring these. These holdings have not been fully cataloged, nor has the U.S. government moved to hold China accountable for its debt obligations. What we're doing is we're holding this debt over them, which was a gold debt. China is eager to be recognized by the international trade and financial community as a market economy. However, in order to be regarded as a responsible and reliable participant in international commerce and finance, China must acknowledge and rectify its multitude transgressions against the United States and the World Trade Organization. So what we're talking about here is China wanted to be a part of the World Trade Organization, but you have to follow the rules. The rules are you can't have outstanding debts and fraudulent things and all kinds of stuff that you've done. You have to be settle all debts, everything has to be settled, everything has to come together. So what we're having now, right now is going on, is a massive restructuring of debt in the world and with the honoring of all fraudulent debt. Every bond deal that any nation has ever put out and is not honored is coming up and must be honored and must be negotiated and settled. So we're in this grand settlement time that's been going on for the last 10 or 20 years. They've been in this period for 10 years, really strong, trying to get all these factors settled. Because it's hard, because governments keep changing, and stuff keeps happening, and governments are overthrown, and who's responsible for the debt, and all that. So you can see the Chinese government bond there. That's the bond that we're talking about involved. Here's another one. This is the 27th year gold loan of the Republic of China, issued in 1938 in United States dollar bonds, and this is for $50 million, and these are coupons. And what you would do if you own this bond, you would every year you would clip a coupon. You see one of them has been clipped here. You would clip a coupon and you would submit it to the Chinese government, and they would pay you your interest. Each year you would clip a coupon, submit it, they would pay you your interest on the. So that's what they look at. What happened? That they did not honor. Well, why didn't they honor? Well, there's several different reasons. One is Chiang Kai-shek was at war with Mao Zedong in China. And eventually Chiang Kai-shek took much of China's gold and went to Taiwan. We called it Formosa at the time. And he took the gold from China with him, and he went there. Well, what happened was that was the gold that was going to be used to pay these loans. You know. So then what happens? We had Japan come in and take over major portions of China, and when they did that, they raped all the gold that they could find in China and other areas, Indonesia, and they took and stashed all that gold that they could find from China and Indonesia, and parts of Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, other areas. The gold was captured and taken and hidden in caves and bunkers in the Philippines and in Indonesia. So now the gold that was going to be used by China to service these bonds, which their intention was to service these bonds, had been confiscated and was buried there. Well, over the years, some of that gold was found in the Philippines, and one of the guys that ended up with his hands on it was Marcos of the Philippines, and he became the wealthiest guy in the world. And he took and he stashed a bunch of that gold in a mountain behind his home. He had a home up in the mountains, which was, during the summer he would go there because the temperatures were so much nicer. And there's a mountain, he hollowed it out and made a great big vault. And he stashed this gold that he had found in these different areas the Japanese had buried it. And he stashed it there. And then when Ronald Reagan was in office, the United States military came in and kidnapped the Marcoses, brought them to Hawaii, and put them on trial. You remember a show trial and the Marcoses, and at the same time, the United States government, well, you say United States government, I don't know which part of the government is a vague area, whether it's the CIA, whether it's some aspect of the U.S. government, captured all of that gold and brought it to the United States of America. We think that gold was most likely stored in the basement of the Twin Towers. That was the gold. So basically what you had was now China owed all this money in gold on these bonds over these years with all the penalties and interest and all the stuff that goes on top of it. And the gold that they were going to pay for it is actually in New York, in the Twin Towers in New York City. And we have control of it. So this is the game that's been being played. This is what you call, what do they call it? The ultimate game. This is the game that's played behind the scenes. The big boys play these games, and nobody really knows what's going on. Newspapers don't report on it except in very vague plans. So basically what J.C. Collins is pointing out here is this. He says, in part one, we were introduced to the 1913 Chinese gold reorganization loan bonds. A final payment on these bonds is indeed in the works, which is going on right now. They're going to pay out these bonds. They're going to honor these bonds. The Chinese are. And that's a part of the 2010 Code of Reforms. What does that mean? The 2010 Code of Reforms. Why would you negotiate something like that? What the 2010 IMF Code of Reforms was this. The Code of Reforms brought in China to the IMF. It put the People's Bank of China director on the board of the IMF as the vice chairman, and the IMF increased their quotas. They doubled the monies that the nations had to put in. That is, an SDR is created by all these nations putting in money. The United States puts in US dollars, and Britain puts in pounds and whatever. They put in all this money, and then they create SDRs out of that. Well, what they did was they doubled the amount of that every nation had to put in, and China was required to put in money as well, and so they put in extra. So what they did was this reorganization gave China a seat at the financial table of the IMF. It's not about quota reforms. They talk about IMF quota reforms. That's meaningless. The quota is nothing. China has its teeth in the IMF and has some controlling power and major influence in the IMF. That's what they did as a part of that. And then he makes this thing. This deal to do this reconciliation has been going on for years. And it looks like it's going to happen, and then it falls apart. And every time it looks like it's going to happen is when the U.S. is having a debt crisis, the budget ceiling debt crisis. Every time. And so I believe that this debt ceiling crisis, we said, is this on purpose or not? I think it's absolutely on purpose. I think we're not going to see things work out. I think eventually we're going to see crisis in this situation, and it's all a part of international jockeying to get some negotiation. Why? Nations are negotiating, signing off on the final things on this right now, on this reestablishment of debt. It's important to know that China, by China honoring the 1913 bonds, will be able to access their full gold reserves, including the portion that was used to support the 1913 bonds. What he's inferring to is this: that China said that Shanghai Shek took all the gold, and therefore we can't honor these bonds. But in reality, they had gold there on hand where they could have, but it would have really strained them to have honored these bonds. So they hid the gold that they actually had on hand, and so they did not have to honor these bonds. Because if they were found in default, they were going to have to they would be kicked out of any kind of international trade. They wouldn't be able to. And how are you going to sell all your goods from China if you can't be a part of international trade? You're an exporting country. So what we found was the first thing we discovered is when Hong Kong was controlled by the British, and China wanted it back. Britain said, in order to get Hong Kong back, you must honor these 1913 gold bonds. So what they did for all British individuals or banks They honored the 1913 bonds, and they paid 10% of their face value to the people that settled for this. And mostly these bonds were not then controlled by Britain. This was all kept under the table. Nobody, this was in small print in the negotiations. But we knew that with that these 1913 bonds would eventually be honored for all nations, because they have now were honored for the Britain in there. He says, with that being said, the bonds will not be honored at their full face value. So I don't know. I think it's about 10%. It may be more in some cases. The problem with it, you can't honor them at full face value. Why? Because they're worth so much today, it would completely distort the whole financial system. I mean, it would just be, people would be getting hundreds of trillions of dollars, because of all the time and penalties and interest and stuff on these bonds. Like any debt consolidation, all sovereign debt must be included. The owners of the Chinese bonds will get their payouts. The payout itself is based on a flat amount already set for the historical bonds. That is, there might be lots of bonds out there, but more or less people might be included in the bonds, but it doesn't change the payout. The payout is the same. That's been negotiated, and so the amount is specifically valued within the renminbi's SDR composition. The more bondholders that come forward will decrease the individual payout for each bondholder. That's basically it. So this approval of the IMF 2010 reforms was a hot button, because Congress had to approve it, and if you voted to approve it, you were voting for the destruction of the US dollar. Is essentially what it was. So they fussed over this for years, and nobody wanted to do it. So what they did was they put it in the budget bill in small print in 2015. In small print, and people just voted for the budget, and by doing so, we voted to release the dollar from U.S. world reserve currency status, and the demand for the dollar is going to fall dramatically because of that. And so we're just entering that period of time right now. Since most countries have sovereign debt and outstanding historical bonds, it stands to reason that other situations like the Chinese bonds will be handled in similar fashion. Yes, there's lots of different nations have debt. A lot of them have fraudulent bonds, things they haven't fully honored, etc. They are going to happen. Japan has what's called the 57s. They're going to be honored and all of that. Another pattern that emerges as we study the history of reserve currencies is that with each reserve currency, the centralization has become tighter and tighter. The control of money, that is. Through increased centralization, the countries of the world have sunk deeper into sovereign debts, from which even more centralization will be offered as the solution. Make no mistake about it, the power the United States has experienced since 1944 and the Bretton Woods Agreement has come from the reserve status of the US dollar. After the reforms are passed and the executive board restructured, the US will become a regular country like every other country in the world. And that's exactly where we're headed. He says here, from the moment the reforms are implemented, the dollar will see multiple devaluations staged to coincide with multi-stage restructuring of the debt. This is a big thing in the world, so it has to be done in steps, and each step has to kind of be resolved as it happens. It is important to mention that with the passage of the reforms, the world will not see an overnight immediate response. The new system will take time to fully integrate. The global currency reset will happen in levels as currencies are allowed to free float within the parameters as set forth by the SDR composition of each country. And the Basel III regulations, which are controlling a lot of this from the Bank of International Settlements, are also set to be fully implemented by 2018. So this has all been set, you know, in the marketplace. With the full implementation of these reforms, we will see all the currencies of the world that are now pegged to the value of the US dollar shift to a more balanced system of weight values be pegged to the value of the SDR as issued by the International Monetary Fund.